Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates painted their nails and talked about boys, she spent hours at the local gym, lifting weights that made grown men stare. Her father, a retired Marine, had taught her that strength wasn't about size or gender. It was about heart and determination. At 22, Sarah stood 5 feet 6 inches tall with a lean but muscular build. Her dark hair was usually pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her brown eyes held a fierce determination that made people take notice. She worked as a personal trainer at the base gym near Fort Braxton, where she trained both civilians and military personnel. The gym was her sanctuary. Every morning at 5, she arrived before anyone else, turning on the lights and preparing for another day of pushing people beyond their limits. The soldiers respected her, though some of the newer recruits would smirk when they first saw her. That smirk usually disappeared after their first training session. Commander Jake "Tank" Morrison was different. He was a Navy SEAL with 15 years of experience, standing 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighing 220 pounds of pure muscle. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. Tank had completed 3 tours in Afghanistan, survived countless dangerous missions, and had never been defeated in hand-to-hand combat. When Tank arrived at Fort Braxton for a joint training exercise, word spread quickly through the base. The SEALs were legendary, and Tank was a legend among legends. His square jaw, steel gray eyes, and confident stride commanded respect from everyone he met. Soldiers would step aside when he walked through the corridors, and even the higher-ranking officers treated him with special deference. Tank had heard about the female trainer at the base gym through casual conversation. Some of the soldiers mentioned her name with respect, while others seemed skeptical about her abilities. He decided to check out this Sarah Martinez for himself, partly out of curiosity and partly because he needed to maintain his physical conditioning during his stay. The first meeting between Sarah and Tank happened on a busy Tuesday morning. The gym was crowded with soldiers working out before their duties began. Sarah was spotting a young private on the bench press when Tank walked in. The entire gym seemed to quiet down as heads turned to watch the famous SEAL commander. Tank scanned the room and immediately spotted Sarah. She was smaller than he expected, but he could see the defined muscles in her arms and shoulders as she helped the private complete his set. She moved with confidence and precision, qualities he respected in any warrior. "You must be the trainer everyone's talking about," Tank said, approaching her with his characteristic confident smile. Sarah looked up at him, unfazed by his imposing presence. "And you must be the SEAL commander who thinks he owns every room he walks into," she replied with a slight smile of her own. Tank raised an eyebrow, surprised by her directness. Most people were either intimidated by him or tried too hard to impress him. This woman seemed to be neither. "I heard you're pretty good at what you do," Tank said, crossing his arms over his chest. "I don't need to be pretty good," Sarah replied, wiping her hands on a towel. "I am good. The question is whether you're ready to find out just how good." The challenge hung in the air between them. Several soldiers had stopped their workouts to listen to the conversation, sensing that something significant was happening. Tank was used to being the alpha in any situation, but this woman was clearly not going to back down. "What did you have in mind?" Tank asked, his competitive nature kicking in. Sarah gestured toward the open area of the gym where mats were laid out for stretching and floor exercises. "How about we see if all that SEAL training taught you anything about real combat?" Tank chuckled, but there was no mockery in it. He was genuinely intrigued by this confident woman, who seemed completely unimpressed by his reputation. "You want to spar with me?" "I want to train with you," Sarah corrected. "Unless you're afraid that a civilian trainer might show you something new." The soldiers around them exchanged glances. No one had ever spoken to Tank Morrison like this, especially not a woman half his size. Tank studied Sarah's face, looking for any sign of doubt or fear. He found none. "All right, trainer," Tank said, extending his hand. "You've got yourself a deal. But don't expect me to go easy on you just because you're a woman." Sarah shook his hand firmly, her grip strong and steady. "I wouldn't want you to. Going easy on someone is the best way to get them hurt in a real fight." As they shook hands, neither of them realized that this moment would change both of their lives forever. The other soldiers began to gather around, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Word started to spread throughout the base that the famous SEAL commander was about to face off against the female trainer. Tank began to stretch, his movements fluid and practiced. He had sparred with some of the best fighters in the world, and while he respected Sarah's confidence, he couldn't imagine that she posed any real challenge to someone with his training and experience. Sarah stretched nearby, her movements equally practiced but different in style. She had studied multiple martial arts disciplines, including Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, and Krav Maga. Her smaller size had forced her to become technical and strategic in her approach to combat. As they prepared to face each other on the mats, the atmosphere in the gym became electric with anticipation. Neither Tank nor Sarah spoke, but their eyes never left each other. This was more than just a friendly sparring session. It was a test of everything they believed about strength, skill, and determination. The crowd of soldiers continued to grow as word spread through the base like wildfire. Within 15 minutes, nearly 50 people had gathered around the training mats. Some stood on chairs and benches to get a better view, while others pressed against the windows from the hallway outside. Tank removed his shirt, revealing a torso covered in scars from his years of service. Each mark told a story of survival and victory. His chest and arms rippled with muscle built through years of the most demanding physical training imaginable. Several soldiers whistled appreciatively, and Tank gave them a quick nod of acknowledgement. Sarah kept her tank top on but removed her sneakers, preferring to fight barefoot for better grip and mobility. Her movements were calm and methodical as she prepared herself mentally for what was to come. She had faced bigger opponents before, but never someone with Tank's level of training and reputation. "Ladies and gentlemen," called out Sergeant Rodriguez, a stocky man who had trained with Sarah for months. "We've got ourselves a real treat today. In the blue corner we have Commander Tank Morrison, Navy SEAL, undefeated in hand-to-hand combat, survivor of more missions than most of us have had hot dinners." The crowd cheered and applauded. Tank raised his hand briefly, acknowledging the support. And in the red corner, Rodriguez continued, "We have our own Sarah Martinez, personal trainer, martial arts expert, and the woman who's made half of you cry during your workouts." This brought laughter and more cheers. Sarah smiled and gave a small wave, but her focus remained entirely on Tank. "This is a friendly sparring match," Rodriguez announced. "No permanent damage, no hospital visits. First person to submit or get pinned for 5 seconds loses. Everyone clear?" Both Tank and Sarah nodded their agreement. They moved to the center of the mat, circling each other slowly. Tank's approach was textbook SEAL, confident, aggressive, looking for quick ways to use his size and strength advantage. He had fought in deserts and jungles in situations where hesitation meant death. Sarah's approach was more fluid and calculating. She watched Tank's feet, his shoulders, his eyes, looking for tells that would give away his intentions. She had learned long ago that the biggest opponents often relied too heavily on their physical advantages and forgot about strategy. Tank made the first move, shooting in for a takedown that would have worked against most opponents. His technique was perfect, his speed impressive for a man his size. But Sarah wasn't there when he arrived. She had sidestepped at the last possible moment, using his momentum against him. As Tank passed by her, Sarah grabbed his arm and used a judo throw that sent him tumbling across the mat. The crowd gasped in surprise. Tank rolled smoothly and came up in a defensive position, his expression showing the first hint of respect for his opponent's skill. "Nice move," Tank admitted, circling again more carefully this time. "You haven't seen anything yet," Sarah replied, but there was no arrogance in her voice, just quiet confidence. Tank adjusted his strategy, realizing that this wouldn't be the quick victory he had expected. He began to use his reach advantage, throwing controlled punches and kicks to test Sarah's defensive abilities. Each strike was precise and powerful, thrown with the skill of someone who had fought for his life countless times. Sarah deflected and avoided most of Tank's attacks, but a few glancing blows reminded her of just how strong her opponent was. When Tank's fist brushed against her shoulder, she felt the power behind it and knew that taking a direct hit would be a serious problem. The two fighters continued to circle and engage, each testing the other's abilities. Tank was impressed by Sarah's speed and technique, while Sarah was gaining respect for Tank's experience and adaptability. Neither had gained a clear advantage after several minutes of sparring. The crowd was completely silent now, absorbed in watching two master fighters at work. Some of the soldiers had initially expected to see Tank dominate quickly, but it was becoming clear that Sarah was far more skilled than anyone had imagined. Tank decided to increase the pressure, launching a combination of strikes that would have overwhelmed most opponents. His fists moved like pistons, each punch thrown with devastating precision. Sarah weaved through the assault like water flowing around rocks, her movements so smooth they seemed almost effortless. As Tank's combination ended, Sarah saw her opportunity. She stepped inside his guard and drove her elbow toward his ribs in a technique she had perfected through years of training. Tank tried to block, but Sarah's timing was perfect. The elbow connected with Tank's ribs with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent gym. Tank's eyes went wide with surprise and pain as he stumbled backward, one hand instinctively moving to his side. The crowd erupted in shocked exclamations. No one had expected to see the legendary SEAL commander hurt by anyone, especially not by a woman half his size. Some soldiers stood up from their seats, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Tank struggled to catch his breath, his face showing a mixture of pain and disbelief. He had been hit hard before, but never with such precision and timing. Sarah had found the exact spot between his ribs where the impact would be most effective. "You okay?" Sarah asked, stepping back and lowering her guard slightly. Despite the competitive nature of their match, she was genuinely concerned about Tank's well-being. Tank straightened up slowly, testing his movement and breathing. The pain was significant, but he could tell that nothing was broken.
He looked at Sarah with new eyes,
seeing not just a confident trainer but a truly skilled fighter who had just taught him a valuable lesson about underestimating opponents. "I'm fine," Tank said, though his voice was strained. That was a hell of a shot. The respect in his voice was unmistakable. In that moment, something shifted between them. This was no longer just a sparring match between two fighters testing each other's abilities. It had become something deeper, a mutual recognition of skill and warrior spirit. Tank rolled his shoulders and adjusted his stance, the pain in his ribs serving as a sharp reminder that he was facing a truly dangerous opponent. The crowd remained silent, waiting to see how the famous SEAL commander would respond to being hurt for the first time in recent memory. "Your turn," Sarah said simply, raising her guard again. Tank nodded and came forward. But his approach was completely different now. Gone was the casual confidence of a fighter who expected an easy victory. In its place was the focused intensity of a warrior who recognized he was in a real fight. The next exchange was faster and more violent than anything the crowd had witnessed before. Tank unleashed a series of strikes that showcased why he was considered one of the most dangerous men alive. His punches came in combinations that would have dropped most fighters, each one thrown with the intention of ending the fight immediately. Sarah found herself being pushed to her absolute limits. Tank's newfound respect for her abilities had made him more dangerous, not less. She blocked and deflected what she could, but several shots got through her defenses, rattling her teeth and testing her resolve. A spinning back fist from Tank caught Sarah on the shoulder, spinning her around and nearly sending her to the mat. The crowd gasped as she stumbled, but she managed to keep her footing and turn the stumble into a rolling movement that brought her back to a fighting stance. Tank pressed his advantage, moving in close to use his size and strength. This was where his SEAL training excelled. In close quarters combat where technique mattered less than raw aggression and the will to survive. He grabbed Sarah in a clinch, trying to use his superior size to control her movement. But Sarah had trained for exactly this scenario. Smaller fighters had to be prepared for larger opponents who wanted to turn the fight into a wrestling match. She used Tank's own momentum and leverage against him, slipping out of his grip and getting behind him in one fluid movement. Before Tank could react, Sarah had her arm around his neck in a rear, naked choke. The crowd erupted as they realized that the female trainer had just put the SEAL commander in a submission hold that could end the fight in seconds. Tank's training kicked in immediately. He tucked his chin to protect his airway and used his strength to try to break Sarah's grip. But Sarah's technique was flawless, her arm positioned perfectly to cut off the blood flow to Tank's brain rather than just restricting his breathing. For a moment, it looked like the fight might be over. Tank's face began to redden as Sarah applied pressure to the choke. Several soldiers in the crowd stood up, ready to call for the submission. But Tank wasn't ready to give up. Using every ounce of his strength and experience, Tank managed to get his feet under him and drive backward, slamming Sarah against the wall of the gym. The impact was tremendous, and Sarah's grip loosened just enough for Tank to break free and spin around to face her. Both fighters were breathing heavily now, sweat covering their bodies as they circled each other again. Sarah's back ached from the impact with the wall, while Tank's neck showed red marks from the choke attempt. The crowd was on its feet, cheering for both fighters. Still think you can take me? Tank asked, but there was no mockery in his voice. He was genuinely curious about Sarah's confidence level after their intense exchange. I don't think anything, Sarah replied, wiping sweat from her forehead. I know I can. Tank couldn't help but smile at her unwavering confidence. In his years of combat, he had rarely met anyone with such unshakable self-belief. It was both inspiring and intimidating. The two fighters engaged again, this time with both of them operating at their highest level. Tank's strikes were crisp and powerful, while Sarah's movement was fluid and precise. They matched each other blow for blow, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. Sarah attempted a high kick that Tank caught, but before he could capitalize on it, she used the position to launch herself into a spinning heel kick with her other leg. Tank ducked just in time, the heel of Sarah's foot whistling past his ear with enough force to have knocked him unconscious. Tank retaliated with a combination that pushed Sarah back across the mat. His fists moved like lightning, each punch thrown with the precision of a master craftsman. Sarah weaved through most of the strikes, but a solid jab caught her in the stomach, doubling her over momentarily. As Sarah bent forward from the body shot, Tank saw his opportunity. He grabbed her shoulders and drove his knee upward toward her midsection, a devastating move that had ended many fights for him in the past. But Sarah wasn't where Tank expected her to be. At the last second, she twisted her body and caught Tank's leg, using his momentum to sweep his supporting leg and send him crashing to the mat. As Tank fell, Sarah maintained control of his leg and immediately moved into a position for a leg lock. The crowd held its breath as Sarah began to apply pressure to Tank's ankle and knee. Leg locks were among the most dangerous submission holds in martial arts, capable of causing serious injury if applied with full force or held too long. Tank found himself in a position he rarely experienced, completely controlled by an opponent who had the ability to seriously hurt him. Sarah's technique was perfect, her leverage giving her the ability to break his leg if she chose to apply maximum pressure. Impressive, Tank grunted, trying to find a way out of the submission. But Sarah's position was too good, her technique too refined. He could feel the pressure building in his ankle, and knew that he had only seconds before the pain would become unbearable. For the first time in years, Tank Morrison found himself considering submission. The realization was shocking to him. He had never given up in a fight, never admitted defeat to any opponent. But the woman controlling his leg had demonstrated skills that demanded his respect and acknowledgement. The crowd watched in stunned silence as their hero struggled against a submission hold applied by someone they had initially underestimated. The lesson was clear to everyone present. True skill and determination could overcome size and reputation. Tank gritted his teeth and used every technique he knew to escape the leg lock, but Sarah's position was too perfect. She had trapped him in a submission that showcased years of technical training and understanding of human anatomy. The pressure on his ankle was increasing steadily, and Tank could feel his options running out. Just as the pain was becoming unbearable, Tank managed to grab Sarah's leg and pull himself close enough to break her leverage. The move required incredible core strength and flexibility, but Tank's desperate situation gave him the motivation to push his body beyond its normal limits. Sarah released the submission rather than risk injuring Tank seriously, but she immediately transitioned to a different attack. As Tank tried to stand up, Sarah swept his legs again and moved into a mount position, sitting on his chest with her knees pinning his arms. The crowd erupted in amazement. Sarah Martinez, the gym trainer they saw every day, had just dominated one of the most elite warriors in the world. Tank found himself looking up at Sarah, completely controlled and unable to use his size advantage. From the mount position, Sarah could have rained down punches or moved into another submission. Instead, she looked down at Tank with a slight smile. Had enough yet, Commander? Tank struggled against her position, but Sarah's base was too solid. Her legs were positioned perfectly to maintain control, and every time Tank tried to bridge or roll, Sarah adjusted seamlessly to stay on top. Not even close, Tank replied, but his voice showed the strain of his efforts. Being controlled so completely was a new experience for him, and it was both frustrating and educational. Sarah leaned forward and whispered something that only Tank could hear. You're strong, but strength without strategy is just wasted energy. Let me show you what I mean. Before Tank could respond, Sarah shifted her weight and grabbed his arm, setting up for an armbar submission. Tank recognized the danger immediately and tried to defend, But Sarah's movement was too smooth and practiced. Within seconds, Tank found his arm extended and controlled, with Sarah's legs across his chest and her hips positioned to create devastating leverage on his elbow joint. It was one of the most fundamental submissions in martial arts, but Sarah's execution was flawless. Tank had two choices: submit or risk serious injury to his arm. As a SEAL, he had been trained to endure pain and never give up. But he was also smart enough to recognize when continuing would be pointless and dangerous. The gym was completely silent as everyone waited to see what would happen. Tank's arm was fully extended, and Sarah had the leverage to break it if she applied full pressure. The famous SEAL commander was completely helpless in the hands of a woman half his size. "I submit," Tank said clearly, his voice carrying across the silent gym. For a moment, nobody moved. The words seemed impossible to believe. Tank Morrison, the legendary SEAL who had never been defeated, had just submitted to Sarah Martinez in front of 50 witnesses. Sarah immediately released the submission and stood up, extending her hand to help Tank to his feet. Tank accepted the help, his face showing a mixture of pain, exhaustion, and genuine respect. The crowd exploded into cheers and applause. Some soldiers were cheering for Sarah's incredible victory, while others were applauding both fighters for the amazing display of skill they had just witnessed. Everyone present knew they had seen something extraordinary. Tank rolled his shoulders and tested his arm, making sure everything was still working properly. The submission had been perfectly applied, tight enough to force the tap but controlled enough to avoid injury. "That was incredible," Tank said, looking at Sarah with newfound admiration. "I've fought all over the world and I've never seen technique like that." Sarah smiled and shook Tank's hand firmly. "You're no joke yourself, Commander. That escape from the leg lock was something special. Most people would have tapped out long before you did." The crowd began to disperse, but many soldiers lingered to talk about what they had just witnessed. The story would spread throughout the base within hours, and by evening, everyone would know that the female trainer had defeated the famous SEAL commander in hand-to-hand combat. Sergeant Rodriguez approached the two fighters, shaking his head in amazement. "In 20 years of military service, I've never seen anything like that. Sarah, that was absolutely incredible. Commander, the way you hung in there was impressive as hell." Tank was still catching his breath, but his demeanor had changed completely. The arrogant confidence he had walked in with was gone, replaced by genuine respect for Sarah's abilities and a hunger to learn from her. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Tank asked Sarah as they walked toward the water station. "Everywhere I could," Sarah replied. "My father started teaching me basic self-defense when I was 8. Then I found a Brazilian jiu-jitsu school, started training in Muay Thai, picked up some Krav Maga techniques. I've been training for 15 years. Tank nodded thoughtfully. "It shows. The way you transitioned between techniques, your timing, your leverage, it was like watching a masterclass in combat sports." Sarah handed Tank a bottle of water and took one for herself. "You're not too bad yourself. That escape from the leg lock required serious flexibility and core strength. And your striking combinations were some of the best I've ever faced." As they talked, Tank found himself more and more impressed by Sarah's knowledge and approach to fighting. She spoke about techniques and strategies with the depth of understanding that only came from years of serious study and practice. "I have to ask," Tank said, "why aren't you in the military? With skills like yours, you could write your own ticket in any special forces unit." Sarah considered the question for a moment. "I thought about it when I was younger, but I realized I could make more of a difference training others than I could as just another soldier. Here I get to help dozens of people become better fighters and stronger individuals." Tank understood the logic, but he couldn't help thinking that the military was missing out on an exceptional warrior. Sarah's combination of technical skill, physical conditioning, and mental toughness would have made her valuable in any combat unit. The conversation was interrupted by Colonel Williams, the base commander who had heard about the match and came to see the aftermath for himself. "Commander Morrison." "Ms. Martinez," the colonel said with a smile, "I understand we had quite a demonstration here today." Both Tank and Sarah straightened up respectfully. Tank's ribs were still aching from Sarah's elbow strike, but he showed no sign of discomfort. "Yes, sir," Tank replied. "Ms. Martinez here just gave me a lesson in humility and technique." Colonel Williams looked between the two fighters, clearly impressed by Tank's gracious attitude in defeat. "Ms. Martinez, I've been getting reports about your training methods for months. After today's display, I think it's time we had a conversation about expanding your role here. Over the next few days, the story of Sarah's victory over Tank spread far beyond Fort Braxton. Social media posts from soldiers who witnessed the fight began circulating, and news outlets picked up the story of the civilian trainer who had defeated a Navy SEAL commander in hand-to-hand combat. Sarah found herself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. Reporters called the gym asking for interviews, and military publications wanted to write feature stories about her training methods. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had always preferred to work quietly behind the scenes. Tank, meanwhile, was experiencing his own form of notoriety. For the first time in his career, he was known not for a victory but for a defeat. Some of his fellow SEALs ribbed him good-naturedly about being beaten by a civilian trainer, while others expressed genuine curiosity about Sarah's techniques. Instead of being bitter about his loss, Tank found himself fascinated by what he had learned. He began visiting the gym daily, not just to maintain his own conditioning, but to observe Sarah's training methods and ask questions about her techniques. "The thing I don't understand," Tank said during one of their conversations, "is how you generated so much power in that elbow strike. I outweigh you by 70 pounds, but you hit harder than guys twice your size." Sarah was spotting a young soldier on the bench press, but she answered while maintaining her focus on safety. "Power doesn't come from size alone. It comes from proper mechanics, timing, and using your whole body as a connected system. When I threw that elbow, my feet, hips, core, and shoulders were all working together." Tank nodded thoughtfully. This was exactly the kind of insight he had been seeking. His SEAL training had made him devastatingly effective in combat, but Sarah's approach was more scientific and technical than anything he had encountered. Colonel Williams had been true to his word about expanding Sarah's role. Within a week of the match, she was offered a position as the base's senior combat instructor, with responsibility for training not just enlisted personnel, but also officers and visiting special forces units. The promotion came with a significant increase in salary and status, but more importantly, it gave Sarah the opportunity to implement her training philosophy on a larger scale. She began developing comprehensive programs that combined traditional military conditioning with advanced martial arts techniques. Tank became one of Sarah's most dedicated students. Despite his years of experience and impressive record, he approached her classes with the humility of a beginner, eager to learn new approaches to combat that could make him more effective. "I want to understand everything," Tank told Sarah after a particularly intense training session. "The way you move, the way you think about positioning, the way you set up your techniques. It's unlike anything I learned in the SEALs." Sarah appreciated Tank's attitude, but she was also impressed by how quickly he absorbed new information. His years of combat experience gave him a foundation that allowed him to understand and implement advanced concepts much faster than typical students. Their training sessions together became legendary on the base. Soldiers would gather to watch whenever Tank and Sarah sparred, witnessing exchanges between two master fighters who were constantly pushing each other to improve. During one memorable session, Tank managed to escape from one of Sarah's submission attempts and briefly gained a dominant position. The crowd cheered, thinking they might see Tank get revenge for his earlier defeat, but Sarah remained calm and used Tank's own momentum to reverse the position and end up back in control. "You're getting better," Sarah told Tank as they reset for another round. "That escape was beautiful." "Not good enough yet," Tank replied with a grin. "But I'm learning." The relationship between Tank and Sarah began to evolve beyond just training partners. They started having dinner together after particularly intense sessions, discussing combat philosophy and sharing stories from their respective backgrounds. Tank told Sarah about his missions overseas, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, and the weight of responsibility that came with leading other soldiers into dangerous situations. Sarah shared her journey from a small-town girl with big dreams to becoming one of the most skilled fighters on a major military base. "I never expected to find someone who understood the warrior mindset the way you do," Tank confided one evening over dinner. "Most people think fighting is about aggression and anger, but you understand that it's really about discipline and respect." Sarah smiled at the compliment. "My father always told me that true warriors fight not because they love violence, but because they love peace enough to defend it." The attraction between them was becoming undeniable. But both Tank and Sarah were careful not to let personal feelings interfere with their professional relationship. They were both dedicated to their roles on the base and understood that their effectiveness as instructors depended on maintaining appropriate boundaries. However, their connection was obvious to everyone around them. Soldiers began referring to them as the power couple, and bets were placed on when they would finally admit their feelings for each other. The turning point came during a joint training exercise with visiting units from other bases. Sarah was demonstrating advanced grappling techniques to a group of Marines when one of the visiting instructors made a disparaging comment about women in combat roles. "I don't care what I just saw," the Marine instructor said loudly. "In a real fight, biology wins every time. No woman can match a trained male warrior." The room fell silent. Everyone present knew about Sarah's victory over Tank, but the visiting instructor apparently did not. Tank stepped forward, his face showing barely controlled anger. "That woman," Tank said in a voice that could cut steel, "just taught me more about real fighting in a week than I learned in 15 years of special operations. If you think biology is more important than skill, you're welcome to test that theory." The Marine instructor looked around the room and realized he had made a serious mistake. The expression on Tank's face made it clear that insulting Sarah was not something he would tolerate from anyone. Sarah placed a gentle hand on Tank's arm, calming him with her touch. "It's okay," she said softly. "Some people have to learn the hard way." Tank looked down at Sarah's hand on his arm and felt something shift inside him. In that moment, he realized that his feelings for her had grown far beyond professional respect or physical attraction. Sarah Martinez had become someone he wanted to protect and support, not because she needed protection, but because she deserved to have someone in her corner who understood her worth. "You're right," Tank said, covering Sarah's hand with his own. "But that doesn't mean I have to like listening to ignorant comments." The gesture was small, but everyone in the room noticed it. The connection between Tank and Sarah was no longer just professional speculation. It was becoming something real and powerful that would change both of their lives forever. 3 months after their first encounter, Tank's deployment orders arrived. He was being reassigned to a special operations unit on the other side of the country, effective in 2 weeks. The news hit both him and Sarah harder than either had expected. They had grown closer during their training sessions together, developing a bond that went far beyond instructor and student. Tank had become Sarah's most dedicated pupil, while Sarah had helped Tank refine his techniques in ways that made him more effective than ever before. 2 weeks, Tank said, staring at the official papers in his hands. They were sitting in Sarah's small office after an evening training session, and the reality of his departure was sinking in. Sarah tried to keep her expression neutral, but Tank could see the disappointment in her eyes. "That's how the military works," she said quietly. "People come and go. Assignments change." Tank set the papers aside and looked directly at Sarah. "What if they didn't have to?" "What do you mean?" Tank took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about this for weeks. What we've built here, the training programs you've developed, the techniques we've been working on, it's bigger than just one base. The military needs instructors like you at every facility." Sarah listened carefully as Tank outlined an idea that had been forming in his mind. He believed that Sarah's training methods could revolutionize how the military approached hand-to-hand combat instruction. Her combination of technical skill and teaching ability was exactly what Special Forces units needed. "I could put in for a transfer to the training command," Tank continued. "We could develop a program together, take it to bases across the country. Your techniques, my connections and experience, we could train the trainers." The idea was ambitious and appealing, but Sarah could see potential complications. "Tank, we need to be honest about what's happening between us. This isn't just about professional collaboration anymore." Tank nodded slowly. "You're right. Somewhere along the way, this stopped being just about fighting techniques and started being about something else entirely." They sat in silence for a moment, both acknowledging what they had been avoiding for weeks. The attraction between them had grown into something deeper, a connection based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. "I care about you, Sarah," Tank said finally, "more than I've cared about anyone in a long time. But I also respect you too much to let personal feelings cloud professional judgment." Sarah appreciated Tank's honesty and his concern for her career. Military bases were notorious for gossip, and relationships between instructors could become complicated quickly. The feeling is mutual, Sarah admitted. But you're right about keeping things professional, at least while we're both here. Tank's face lit up with hope. Does that mean you'll consider the training program idea? We could make a real difference in how the military approaches combat instruction. Over the next week, Tank and Sarah worked together to develop a detailed proposal for a new military-wide combat training program. They outlined curricula that would combine traditional military tactics with advanced martial arts techniques, creating more well-rounded and effective fighters. Sarah's scientific approach to technique development impressed the officers who reviewed their proposal. She had documented every training method, analyzed effectiveness rates, and developed progression systems that could be implemented consistently across different units. Tank used his reputation and connections to get their proposal in front of the right people. Despite his recent defeat, his track record and expertise carried significant weight in military circles. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Senior officers recognized the value of what Tank and Sarah were proposing, especially given the changing nature of modern warfare, where special operations required increasingly sophisticated, hand-to-hand combat skills. Colonel Williams became their strongest advocate, writing letters of recommendation that praised both Sarah's innovative training methods and Tank's ability to adapt and implement new techniques. He had seen firsthand how their collaboration had improved the combat readiness of soldiers on his base. This is the kind of forward thinking the military needs, Colonel Williams told them during a meeting in his office. Traditional training methods have served us well, but warfare is evolving. We need instructors who can evolve with it. The approval came through just days before Tank's scheduled departure. They would be transferred together to Fort Bragg in North Carolina, where they would establish the first implementation of their comprehensive combat training program. Sarah would be promoted to Master Instructor, a civilian position that carried significant authority and responsibility. Tank would transfer to the training command as a senior instructor, where his operational experience would complement Sarah's technical expertise. The night before their departure, the base held a farewell celebration for both instructors. Soldiers who had trained with them shared stories about how their techniques had improved their confidence and capabilities. Ms. Martinez taught me that being smaller doesn't mean being weaker, said Private Johnson, a young soldier who had struggled with confidence issues. Her techniques showed me how to use my brain instead of just my muscles. Commander Morrison proved that even the best fighters can get better, added Sergeant Parks, watching him learn from. Ms. Martinez taught all of us that there's always room for improvement. Tank and Sarah stood together during the celebration, accepting congratulations and well wishes from colleagues who had become friends. The bond between them was obvious to everyone present, though they maintained professional composure throughout the evening. As the celebration wound down, Tank and Sarah found themselves alone on the gym floor where they had first met. The mats where they had fought were empty now, but the memory of that first encounter remained vivid for both of them. Hard to believe it all started here, Sarah said, looking around the familiar space. Tank smiled and moved closer to her. Started? I think this is just the beginning. Sarah looked up at him, seeing not the arrogant SEAL commander who had walked into her gym months earlier, but a man who had become her partner, her student, and something much more important. You know, she said with a slight smile, when this assignment is over and we're not working together anymore. Tank understood immediately. When we're not bound by professional constraints anymore, we can explore what this really is between us. Sarah nodded. But until then, we focus on the mission. We build something that will make fighters better and save lives. Tank extended his hand and Sarah shook it firmly. It was a professional gesture, but the warmth in their eyes promised something deeper waiting in the future. Partners? Tank asked. Partners, Sarah confirmed, in every way that matters. 2 years later, the Tank and Martinez combat training program had been implemented at 15 military bases across the United States. Their innovative approach to hand-to-hand combat instruction had reduced training injuries by 30% while significantly improving the tactical capabilities of Special Forces units. Sarah had earned recognition as one of the premier combat instructors in the military, despite never having served in uniform herself. Her techniques were being taught to Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, and Air Force pararescue teams. The girl from small-town Texas had become a legend in military training circles. Tank had also evolved during their partnership. Working with Sarah had taught him that true strength came not from dominating others but from lifting them up. His role as senior instructor allowed him to shape the next generation of special operations warriors, passing on not just combat techniques but also the values of respect and continuous learning. Their professional success was matched by personal happiness. 6 months after completing their initial assignment at Fort Bragg, when they were no longer required to work directly together, Tank and Sarah had finally explored the romantic connection that had been building between them for years. Their relationship had developed naturally, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared experiences that few couples could understand. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, had seen each other at their best and worst, and had chosen to commit to building something lasting together. The morning of their wedding was crisp and clear, with the ceremony taking place in a small chapel near Fort Bragg. Tank wore his dress uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons that represented years of distinguished service. Sarah wore a simple but elegant white dress that allowed her to move comfortably. Even on her wedding day, she preferred practical choices. The guest list included soldiers from every base where they had taught, colleagues who had become family, and Sarah's father, who had traveled from Texas to give his daughter away. Tank's parents had flown in from California, proud to see their son marry someone who had earned his respect so completely. Colonel Williams, now a general, served as Tank's best man. In his speech, he talked about how the partnership between Tank and Sarah had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless soldiers who had learned from them. "I've seen a lot of partnerships in my military career," General Williams said to the assembled guests, "but I've never seen two people who complement each other the way these two do. Tank makes Sarah stronger and Sarah makes Tank better. Together they've created something that's greater than the sum of its parts." Sarah's maid of honor was Lieutenant Rachel Chen, a young officer who had been one of her first students and had gone on to become an instructor herself. In her speech, Rachel talked about how Sarah had shown her that strength came in many forms. "Sarah taught me that winning isn't about being the biggest or the strongest," Rachel said. "It's about being the smartest, the most prepared, and the most determined." She broke through barriers not by demanding respect but by earning it, one technique at a time. During the ceremony, Tank and Sarah exchanged vows that reflected their unique journey together. Tank promised to always be Sarah's student as well as her husband, to never stop learning from her wisdom and strength. Sarah promised to be Tank's partner in all things, to support his growth while continuing to challenge him to be his best self. "You taught me that true victory isn't about defeating others," Tank said during his vows. "It's about becoming the person you're meant to be. You've made me better in every way that matters." Sarah's vows were equally heartfelt. "You showed me that strength and humility can coexist, that a true warrior fights not to prove superiority but to protect what matters. You've been my worthy opponent and my greatest supporter." The reception was held in the base's community center, decorated with photographs from their training programs and letters from soldiers whose lives they had impacted. The walls told the story of their journey from that first encounter in the gym to the comprehensive training program that now bore their names. During their first dance, Tank and Sarah moved together with the same fluid precision they brought to everything else. They had spent years learning to anticipate each other's movements in combat, and that awareness translated beautifully to the dance floor. "Any regrets?" Tank asked as they swayed to the music. Sarah smiled up at him. "About which part? Beating you up in front of 50 witnesses or falling in love with you despite your terrible first impression?" Tank laughed. "I prefer to think of it as getting defeated by the most skilled fighter I've ever encountered." "That's a much better way to look at it," Sarah agreed. "And to answer your question, no regrets at all. Everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to." As the evening continued, speakers took turns sharing stories about Tank and Sarah's impact on their lives and careers. Soldiers talked about techniques they had learned, confidence they had gained, and battles they had won using skills acquired in Tank and Sarah's classes. Private Johnson, now Sergeant Johnson, spoke about how Sarah's training had helped him during a deployment in Afghanistan. "The confidence she gave me saved my life and the lives of my teammates," he said. "Her techniques work in the real world, when everything is on the line." A Navy SEAL named Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez talked about how Tank's humility and learning from Sarah had changed his own approach to training. "Seeing someone of Tank's caliber admit he could learn something new taught all of us that growth never stops." no matter how experienced you think you are. As the reception wound down, Tank and Sarah found themselves once again alone together, this time on the steps of the community center under a sky full of stars. The celebration continued inside, but they needed a moment to process the magnitude of the day. From sworn enemies to training partners to husband and wife, Sarah mused. It's been quite a journey. Tank put his arm around his new wife and pulled her close. The best journeys are the ones you take with someone who makes you better than you could be alone. Sarah leaned into Tank's embrace, thinking about how much their lives had changed since that first day in the gym. What had started as a challenge between two proud fighters had evolved into a partnership that was making a real difference in the world. So what's next for the Tank and Martinez team? Tank asked. Sarah smiled at the question. They had received offers to develop training programs for law enforcement agencies, to write books about their techniques, and to establish their own private training facility. The possibilities seemed endless. Whatever comes next, Sarah said, we'll face it the same way we faced everything else, together as partners, making each other stronger. As they sat together under the stars, both Tank and Sarah knew that their greatest victories lay not in the battles they had won individually, but in the life they had built together. Their story had begun with a physical contest that Sarah had won decisively, but it had evolved into something much more valuable, a partnership based on mutual respect, continuous growth, and unwavering support for each other's dreams. The woman who had been told she could never beat the SEAL commander had done much more than break his ribs in front of a crowd of soldiers. She had earned his respect, captured his heart, and together they had built something that would impact the lives of warriors for generations to come. Their love story was proof that the best partnerships are forged not in moments of easy agreement, but in the crucible of challenge, where two strong people choose to make each other stronger rather than trying to prove who is strongest. Tank and Sarah had found in each other not just opponents worth defeating, but partners worth building a lifetime with.